The Hürtgen Forest, November 19, 1944. The Panzer IV sat silent in a shallow depression east of the village of Vosnack, its engine ticking as metal cooled in the freezing rain. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, Unteroffizier Klaus Reinhardt pressed his forehead against the gunner's periscope, scanning the tree line 200 meters ahead where American infantry had been reported. Behind him, loader Gefreiter Otto Beck kept one hand on an armor-piercing round and the other wrapped around his rosary beads, lips moving in silent prayer. The radio crackled. Enemy armor. Grid reference follows. Reinhardt's stomach tightened. Panthers and Tigers could handle American Shermans, but his Panzer IV, with its 75mm gun and inadequate frontal armor, was increasingly outmatched in this war's final year. Beck reached for the ammunition rack, fingers hovering over the different shell types. His hand trembled, not from cold, but from something else entirely. Fear that speaking the wrong words would break whatever fragile protection kept them alive. Load armor piercing, Reinhardt ordered. Beck grabbed the round, feeling its familiar weight, 23 pounds of steel and explosive. But he didn't announce it, didn't say the caliber, didn't speak the designation that would remind everyone in that metal coffin exactly what they were facing. He simply slid it into the breech and tapped Reinhardt's shoulder. Loaded. Ready. This wasn't standard procedure. German gunnery doctrine required loaders to verbally confirm ammunition type to prevent catastrophic mistakes. But somewhere between Normandy and the Siegfried Line, between the hedgerows and the winter forests, Panzer crews had stopped following that rule, because saying 88mm aloud, even in reference to their own guns, had become a kind of curse. A reminder that the Americans now fielded tank destroyers and heavy tanks with guns that matched or exceeded anything Germany could produce, that the technological superiority German propaganda had promised was evaporating like morning fog. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The superstition spread through panzer units in whispers and knowing glances. Crews who spoke calibers aloud seemed to attract enemy fire. Loaders who announced shell types saw their tanks burn. It was irrational, statistically meaningless. But when you're sitting in 30 tons of steel that can be penetrated by American 76mm guns at 600 meters, when your own 75mm struggled to penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at that same range, rationality becomes a luxury you can't afford. The German Panzer Arm entered World War II with technological and tactical advantages that seemed insurmountable. September 1939. Poland fell in 5 weeks. May 1940. France, the nation that had dominated continental warfare for centuries, collapsed in 6 weeks. German armor doctrine, combining concentrated tank formations with air support and mechanized infantry, achieved victories that shocked the world and seemed to validate every claim about Germanic military supremacy. The Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks that spearheaded these campaigns weren't particularly sophisticated compared to their opponents. French tanks often had thicker armor and more powerful guns. Soviet 34 tanks discovered in 1941 possessed revolutionary sloped armor and wide tracks that gave them superior cross-country mobility. But German crews were superbly trained, German tactics were revolutionary, and German operational coordination was unmatched. Tank crews learned to operate as cohesive units within larger combined arms formations. Radio communications allowed rapid tactical adjustments. Commanders led from the front, making decisions based on real-time battlefield observation rather than predetermined plans. The results spoke for themselves. In the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa, German panzer groups advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, encircling entire Soviet armies in pockets that yielded millions of prisoners. This success bred confidence that hardened into arrogance. German tank crews began to believe their victories stemmed from inherent superiority, technical and tactical, rather than from specific advantages in training, communications, and operational doctrine that could be copied or countered. They underestimated their opponent's capacity to learn and adapt. More critically, They failed to recognize that Germany's industrial base could not sustain the attrition of mechanized warfare against enemies with vastly greater production capacity. By 1943, the illusion of invincibility had shattered. The Panzer arm that had terrorized Europe now fought desperately against numerically superior enemies equipped with increasingly capable weapons. At Kursk, in July 1943, the largest armored battle in history, German panzer divisions achieved initial tactical successes, but ultimately failed to break through Soviet defenses. The operation cost Germany approximately 760 tanks destroyed or damaged. Losses that could not be replaced at the rate Soviet factories were producing 34s. In North Africa, German and Italian forces surrendered in May 1943, losing their remaining armor in Tunisia. The Mediterranean was now an Allied lake. Sicily fell in July and August. Italy itself was invaded in September. Each defeat cost tanks that German industry struggled to replace, while simultaneously ramping up production of new, heavier designs like the Panther and Tiger. These new tanks represented Germany's answer to the crisis of panzer inadequacy. The Panther, introduced in mid-1943, mounted an excellent 75mm gun with superior penetration characteristics compared to the older Panzer IV. The Tiger, already in limited service since late 1942, carried the legendary 88mm gun adapted from the Flak 36 anti-aircraft weapon that had proven devastatingly effective against both aircraft and tanks. On paper, these vehicles restored German technological superiority. In practice, they introduced new problems. Panthers and Tigers were mechanically complex, requiring extensive maintenance by skilled crews. Their weight stressed drivetrains and suspensions beyond design limits, causing frequent breakdowns. Fuel consumption was enormous, straining Germany's increasingly inadequate petroleum supplies. Production numbers remained far below requirements. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers and around 1,300 Tigers of all variants during the entire war. The Soviet Union produced over 57,034 tanks alone. For every Panther rolling off German assembly lines, the United States was producing 3 Shermans. The Americans were also fielding the M36 tank destroyer, with a 90mm gun capable of penetrating any German armor at combat ranges. The British deployed the Sherman Firefly, mounting a powerful 17-pounder gun that could kill Tigers frontally. German tank crews, who had entered the war confident in their technical superiority, now faced enemies whose equipment matched or exceeded their own. The psychological impact was profound and rarely discussed in official reports. Panzer crews had been raised on propaganda, emphasizing German technical excellence and industrial might. They had been told their tanks were the finest in the world, their training the most rigorous, their tactics unbeatable. Combat experience was systematically contradicting every element of that narrative. Reinhardt had joined the Panzer forces in early 1943, trained in the optimistic months when Germany still believed it could win the war through better equipment and superior fighting spirit. His instructors at the Panzer School emphasized aggressive tactics, rapid maneuver, and the technical superiority of German armor. They taught him that German 8.8cm guns could destroy any enemy tank at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, that German optics were the finest in the world, that German armor protection was adequate against enemy weapons. None of it was entirely false. German guns were excellent, German optics were superb, German armor, when properly angled, could deflect many enemy rounds. But the instructors had failed to mention that American production capacity meant that for every German tank destroyed, 3 more Shermans would take its place, that Soviet factories were producing tanks faster than German guns could destroy them. That Allied air superiority meant German armor could barely move during daylight hours without risking annihilation from fighter bombers. Reinhardt learned these truths in Normandy during July and August 1944. His first Panzer IV, a factory-fresh vehicle with unblemished paint, lasted 9 days before an Allied fighter bomber caught them on a road march. The pilot's rockets missed, but cannon fire shredded the engine compartment and started a fuel fire. The crew escaped, barely, and watched their tank burn. Reinhardt remembered thinking that this wasn't how it was supposed to work. German tanks didn't just burn from aircraft attack, they were supposed to be protected by Luftwaffe fighters that never appeared. His second tank, a replacement vehicle cobbled together from salvaged parts, survived 3 weeks before a Sherman put a 76mm round through the side armor during a confused engagement near Morton. The American gun, firing from a hull-down position Reinhardt never spotted, penetrated cleanly and killed his loader instantly. Reinhardt and the rest of the crew bailed out as ammunition began cooking off. He remembered lying in a ditch, covered in his loader's blood, listening to his tank explode and wondering why German intelligence had never mentioned that American tanks now carried guns capable of defeating Panzer IV armor at fighting ranges. His third tank, the one he was commanding now in the Hürtgen Forest, had come with Otto Beck as loader. Beck was 34 years old, ancient by Panzer crew standards, pulled from a construction battalion because the replacement system had run out of young men. He had never wanted to be a tanker. He was terrified of fire, having seen what happened to crews trapped in burning vehicles. He performed his duties with mechanical precision but spoke only when necessary and never joked like the younger loaders Reinhardt had known earlier in the war. Beck had developed the habit of whispering ammunition types rather than announcing them. Reinhardt had initially tried to correct this deviation from proper procedure, but after their first engagement, when an American tank destroyer's 90mm round had missed them by meters and Beck had gone white as snow, Reinhardt stopped insisting on proper protocol. Let the man whisper, let him pray, let him keep whatever mental armor helped him function in this steel trap. The superstition about speaking calibers started, as near as anyone could determine, with a Panzer battalion operating near Cayenne in July 1944. A Tiger company had been ambushed by British Fireflies. Shermans upgraded with 17-pounder guns, specifically designed to kill heavy German tanks. The engagement was brief and catastrophic. 4 Tigers destroyed in as many minutes, their vaunted 88mm guns never getting off effective shots before British armor-piercing rounds penetrated their frontal armor. The survivors, shaken and traumatized, began avoiding mention of the 88mm gun that was supposed to make them invincible. Speaking the caliber aloud seemed to invite comparison with enemy weapons that could now kill Tigers at ranges the crews had been told were safe. Better to simply load the rounds silently and hope that not naming the gun would somehow preserve the illusion of superiority. The practice spread through informal channels, never officially acknowledged but widely adopted. Commanders noticed but rarely corrected it. They understood. They had seen the intelligence reports showing American tank destroyer battalions equipped with 90mm guns. They had read after-action reports describing Panthers knocked out by Soviet 122mm guns at impossible ranges. They knew that Germany's technical advantages were evaporating, replaced by numerical inferiority and industrial exhaustion, letting the crews keep their superstitions, their small psychological defenses against the mathematical reality of their situation seemed a minor concession. Besides, experienced commanders had superstitions of their own. Some refused to command tanks with certain serial numbers, others carried lucky charms or performed private rituals before combat. When you're fighting a losing war in machines that can kill you in a microsecond, rationality becomes negotiable. The ammunition itself told the story of Germany's declining position. Reinhardt's Panzer IV carried 3 types of 75mm ammunition, high explosive rounds for use against infantry and soft targets, armor-piercing rounds with ballistic caps for use against enemy tanks, and, increasingly rare, tungsten core armor-piercing composite rigid rounds that could penetrate heavier armor but required materials Germany could no longer obtain in sufficient quantities. Each shell represented a carefully calculated compromise between penetration capability, production cost, and available materials. The standard armor-piercing rounds used steel, penetrators that relied on velocity and weight to punch through enemy armor. They worked adequately against Sherman side armor and older Soviet tanks. Against frontal armor of modern American and Soviet vehicles, especially at longer ranges, they were marginally effective at best. The tungsten core rounds, designated Panzergranate 40, used a dense, heavy metal core that dramatically improved penetration. But tungsten was a strategic material that Germany had largely imported from neutral nations before the war. By late 1944, those imports had effectively ceased. Domestic tungsten mines couldn't meet demand. What little tungsten Germany produced went primarily to machine tool production and only secondarily to ammunition. Panzer IV crews received tungsten core ammunition in tiny quantities, often just 2 or 3 rounds per tank, with strict orders to use them only against heavy enemy armor when absolutely necessary. Reinhardt's current load included exactly 2 Panzergranate 40 rounds, carefully marked and stored separately from the standard ammunition. He had never fired one. He was saving them for an emergency that would justify expending such precious resources. The Americans faced no such constraints. Their 76mm armor-piercing rounds, while not quite matching the penetration of Panzergranate 40, were produced in unlimited quantities. American tanks could fire tungsten core ammunition as liberally as they wished because the United States controlled tungsten-producing regions and possessed the industrial capacity to manufacture any quantity required. German crews rationing 2 rounds per tank watched American Shermans fire dozens of rounds per engagement and understood exactly what that disparity meant about industrial capacity and resource availability. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The deeper story lived in the production statistics that German panzer crews never saw, but that shaped every aspect of their combat experience. In 1944, Germany produced approximately 9,000 tanks and assault guns of all types. The United States produced 17,000 tanks that same year, along with thousands of tank destroyers and armored fighting vehicles. The Soviet Union produced 29,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The Axis faced approximately a 5-to-1 numerical disadvantage in armored vehicle production, fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The mathematics were brutal and absolute. Germany could not replace losses at the rate combat imposed them. Every panzer destroyed represented an irreplaceable asset. Every experienced crew killed was gone forever, replaced by hastily trained recruits with minimal preparation. American and Soviet forces, by contrast, absorbed horrific losses and kept fighting because their industries simply built more tanks faster than combat could destroy them. An American tank battalion that lost half its vehicles in combat would be fully re-equipped within weeks. A German panzer battalion that suffered similar losses might wait months for replacements that never arrived in sufficient numbers. This disparity shaped tactical and operational decision-making in ways that destroyed German morale. Aggressive tactics that had worked brilliantly in 1940 and 1941, when German tanks outnumbered and outclassed their opponents, became suicidal by 1944, when every engagement risked irreplaceable equipment against numerically superior enemies who would return with more tanks tomorrow. German commanders increasingly emphasized defensive operations and careful husbanding of scarce armor. Panzer divisions that should have been concentrating for decisive counterattacks were instead parceled out in small groups to plug gaps in crumbling defensive lines. Tigers and Panthers, designed as offensive breakthrough vehicles, spent most of their operational time in ambush positions or desperate defensive battles against overwhelming odds. The psychological toll was measurable in declining combat effectiveness and rising psychiatric casualties. German soldiers had been conditioned to believe in inevitable victory through superior will and better equipment. By late 1944, neither assumption held. The enemy clearly possessed stronger will, demonstrated through their ability to absorb casualties that would have broken any German formation, and increasingly superior equipment, proven by tanks that could kill Panthers frontally and tank destroyers that could penetrate Tiger armor at combat ranges. Reinhardt had watched this psychological deterioration in his own crew and in the wider unit. The optimistic confidence of early 1943 had given way to grim determination by mid-1944, then to fatalistic resignation by autumn. Men stopped talking about winning the war and started talking about surviving until tomorrow. They stopped believing in German technical superiority and started hoping that numerical inferiority wouldn't kill them before the war ended. The superstition about whispered ammunition types was just one symptom of this broader collapse of confidence, but it was revealing precisely because it contradicted fundamental military discipline. German forces prided themselves on strict adherence to procedure and protocol. That panzer crews across multiple units independently developed and maintained a practice that violated basic gunnery doctrine demonstrated how completely the gap between propaganda and reality had undermined faith in the official narrative. Beck tapped Reinhardt's shoulder again, a nervous habit the loader had developed. Still ready, still waiting. The American infantry ahead hadn't moved, probably waiting for their own armor support before advancing. Standard American doctrine, Reinhardt had learned, emphasized overwhelming firepower and careful coordination. They never attacked without artillery preparation, never advanced without tank support if enemy armor might be present, never took unnecessary risks because they didn't need to. The Americans could afford to wait for perfect conditions because time favored them. Every day the front remained static was another day for American industry to produce more shells, more tanks, more aircraft. Every German vehicle destroyed was gone forever. Every American vehicle destroyed would be replaced tomorrow. The mathematics favored patience, and the Americans understood mathematics better than German propaganda had ever admitted. Reinhardt heard the distinctive rumble of heavy engines moving through the forest. Not the high-pitched whine of German Maybach engines, but the deeper, throatier sound of American radials, Shermans. Multiple vehicles, probably a platoon. He pressed harder against his periscope, trying to spot them through the trees and rain. His hand moved to the turret traverse, ready to engage the moment targets appeared. Beck must have heard it too, because his breathing changed, becoming shallow and quick. The rosary beads clicked faster. Reinhardt didn't tell him to stop. Didn't remind him that prayer wouldn't stop armor-piercing rounds. Didn't mention that their Panzer IV, with its inadequate gun and thin frontal armor, was hopelessly outmatched against multiple Shermans in close terrain where maneuver was impossible. He just waited, because that's all they could do now. Wait for the Americans to appear. Wait to see if their first shot would be accurate enough to kill a Sherman before return fire destroyed them. Wait to discover whether today was the day the statistics caught up with them. And through it all, Beck would load ammunition in silence, whispering types so quietly that only God could hear him, because speaking German calibers aloud had become a prayer to a future that no longer existed. The Hürtgen Forest swallowed sound. Rain pattered on the tank's steel hull. Engines idled. And somewhere in the trees ahead, American armor moved closer. The engagement lasted 47 seconds. Reinhardt saw the Sherman's hull appear through a gap in the trees, angled slightly away, presenting its side armor at maybe 250 meters. He traversed the turret smoothly, muscle memory guiding his hands while his mind calculated lead and elevation. Beck had already loaded armor-piercing without being told. The tap on Reinhardt's shoulder came as the crosshairs settled on the Sherman's engine deck. Fire. The 75mm gun roared, the breech slamming back in its cradle as the hull rocked on its suspension. Through the smoke, Reinhardt watched the tracer arc toward the target, saw it strike high on the Sherman's side, saw sparks shower off the armor. Hit, but no secondary explosion, no fire, no catastrophic kill. The round had penetrated but hadn't disabled the tank. The Sherman's turret began traversing toward them with terrifying speed. American turret motors, electrically powered, could rotate faster than German manual traverse systems. Beck was already loading the second armor-piercing round, hands moving frantically, breath coming in gasps. Reinhardt adjusted aim, trying to hit the turret ring where armor was thinnest, but the Sherman fired first. The American 76mm round missed by centimeters, passing through the space where their turret had been an instant before and detonating against a tree behind them. The concussion was deafening. Reinhardt's ears rang. He fired their second round without conscious thought, pure reflex born of training and desperation. This one struck the Sherman's turret face and penetrated. The American tank shuddered, stopped moving, began smoking. Back! Reverse! Reinhardt screamed into the intercom. Their driver threw the Panzer IV into reverse, backing deeper into their prepared position as two more Shermans emerged from the tree line. These weren't surprised. These were ready. Their guns were already tracking. The first Sherman fired. The round hit their frontal glacis at an angle and ricocheted upward with a shriek of tortured metal. The second Sherman fired half a second later. This round punched through their right track and detonated against the suspension. The Panzer IV lurched violently sideways, immobilized. Reinhardt didn't need to give the order. Beck and the rest of the crew were already bailing out, abandoning the tank before the Shermans could fire again. Reinhardt grabbed the turret's emergency release and hauled himself through the hatch as another 76mm round slammed into their abandoned vehicle. He hit the ground running, following Beck into the tree line as their Panzer IV began to burn behind them. They ran 200 meters before collapsing behind a fallen log, gasping for breath in the freezing rain. Behind them, ammunition cooked off in their burning tank with sharp cracks and bangs. Reinhardt counted his crew by reflex. All present, all alive. Their third consecutive tank destroyed. Their third consecutive miraculous escape. Beck was crying, silent tears mixing with rain on his face, rosary beads still clutched in his white-knuckled hand. He looked at Reinhardt with eyes that held no hope, no fighting spirit, nothing but exhausted acceptance of inevitable death merely postponed. "How many more?" he whispered. "How many more tanks until we don't make it out?" Reinhardt had no answer. The statistics were clear to anyone willing to see them. German tank crew casualties in the West had exceeded 50% by late 1944. Every engagement reduced their odds of survival. Eventually, the mathematics would catch them. Eventually, they would be too slow or unlucky, or the enemy would be too accurate. Eventually, their tank would burn with them still inside. The German Panzer arms decline wasn't just numerical or technological. It was systemic, rooted in strategic decisions made years earlier that were only now revealing their full catastrophic consequences. The roots traced back to Germany's pre-war industrial policy and its failure to prepare adequately for sustained mechanized warfare against multiple great powers simultaneously. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, Germany's armoured forces consisted of training vehicles and experimental prototypes. The Versailles Treaty had prohibited German tank development, forcing military planners to conduct secret armour research in cooperation with the Soviet Union throughout the 1920s. When Hitler repudiated Versailles restrictions and began open rearmament, Germany possessed theoretical knowledge but limited practical experience in tank design or production. The Panzer I and Panzer II light tanks that equipped early German armoured divisions were never intended as front-line combat vehicles. They were training tools, designed to build tactical experience and organizational structure, while heavier designs reached production. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, Germany's primary battle tanks from 1939 through 1942, represented competent designs that matched or slightly exceeded their contemporaries in most categories. But Germany never developed the industrial base necessary to produce these vehicles in quantities matching potential enemies. In 1940, at the height of Germany's military success, German factories produced approximately 2,300 tanks. The Soviet Union, despite Stalin's purges devastating its industrial management and military leadership, still produced approximately 2,800 tanks that same year. The disparity only widened. Soviet tank production increased every year of the war, reaching over 28,000 vehicles in 1944. American tank production, starting from virtually nothing in 1940, reached over 29,000 vehicles by 1943. German production, constrained by strategic bombing, resource shortages, and competing industrial priorities, peaked at around 19,000 vehicles in 1944, but most of those were assault guns and tank destroyers rather than true battle tanks. The numbers told an unambiguous story. Germany was being buried under an avalanche of enemy armour that its industrial base could not match. Every tactical victory, every impressive kill ratio achieved by skilled German crews in superior vehicles, meant nothing against the strategic reality that the enemy could afford losses that would cripple German formations. This reality shaped crew psychology in ways official doctrine never acknowledged. German tankers entered service believing their training and equipment gave them decisive advantages. Combat experience systematically destroyed that belief. By late 1944, veteran crews understood that individual skill and vehicle quality mattered far less than the brutal mathematics of attrition. A Tiger tank might achieve 10-to-1 kill ratios in ideal circumstances, but if the enemy could afford to lose 10 tanks for every Tiger destroyed, and could replace those losses faster than German factories could produce new Tigers, then the tactical superiority of the Tiger became strategically irrelevant. German crews grasped this reality long before their commanders officially acknowledged it. The psychological impact manifested in numerous ways beyond the superstition about whispered calibers. Crews developed elaborate rituals and lucky charms. Some refused to crew vehicles with certain numbers or markings. Others performed specific routines before combat, putting on equipment in precise sequences or saying particular prayers. Tank commanders carried photographs, letters, or religious items that supposedly provided protection. None of it was rational. All of it was understandable. When you face overwhelming odds in a vehicle that can kill you instantly if penetrated, when you've watched friends burn alive in their tanks, when you know that your own destruction is probably just a matter of time, rationality provides no comfort. Superstition offers the illusion of control. The belief that certain behaviors might influence survival provides psychological armor that steel plate cannot. German military psychiatrists noted increasing rates of combat stress reactions among armored forces by 1944, though they rarely used that terminology. Official reports described crews suffering from exhaustion or nervous strain that rendered them temporarily unfit for combat. Unofficially, tankers called it Panzer Angst, tank fear, a condition that manifested as tremors, inability to sleep, hypervigilance, and sometimes complete psychological breakdown. The causes were obvious to anyone paying attention. Panzer crews faced threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Enemy tanks that could kill them at ranges once considered safe, tank destroyers with powerful guns positioned in ambush, fighter bombers that appeared without warning and destroyed vehicles with rockets or bombs before crews could react, infantry with handheld anti-tank weapons like the American bazooka or Soviet anti-tank rifles that could penetrate side armor at close range. Every mission meant running a gauntlet of potential death from threats that had multiplied exponentially since the war's early years. The Panzer Arm that had terrorized Europe in 1940 now operated in an environment where every road march risked air attack, every engagement meant facing numerically superior enemies, and every dawn brought new casualties that could not be replaced. Reinhardt and Beck reached their battalion assembly area after dark, part of a steady stream of survivors trickling back from the day's fighting. They found, perhaps 30 men gathered around a field kitchen, the remnants of a battalion that had started the month with over 500 personnel. 3 Panzer IVs remained operational from an initial complement of 14. The other tanks were destroyed, disabled, or abandoned for lack of fuel and spare parts. The battalion commander, a major who looked 60 though he was barely 40, didn't ask for detailed reports. He just nodded as crews checked in, making notations in a battered notebook. Everyone understood. There was nothing to report that he didn't already know. They'd fought, they'd lost vehicles, they'd survived. Tomorrow they would receive orders to do it again with whatever equipment remained functional. Beck sat apart from the others, still clutching his rosary, staring at nothing. Reinhardt recognized the signs. He'd seen them in other men, seen them in mirrors when he allowed himself to look closely. The 1,000-yard stare of someone who had absorbed more horror than his mind could process, who continued functioning through sheer mechanical habit, while something essential inside had already broken. "How long can we keep doing this?" Beck asked when Reinhardt sat beside him. Not a question expecting an answer, just words spoken into the void because silence had become unbearable. "Until we can't," Reinhardt said. Which was the truth. They would fight until they died or until the war ended, whichever came first. Those were the only options. Surrender meant Soviet prisoner of war camps, and everyone had heard the stories about what happened to Germans captured by the Red Army. Desertion meant execution by SS field police who prowled rear areas, specifically hunting men who had abandoned their posts. So they would climb into another Panzer IV tomorrow, and Beck would load ammunition while whispering shell types, and they would engage enemy tanks that outnumbered them and probably possessed better guns, and they would hope that statistics didn't catch them. Until eventually, inevitably, they did. The winter of 1944 became the winter of 1945, and the German panzer arms collapse accelerated. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble to split Allied forces and capture Antwerp, consumed Germany's last strategic reserves of armour and fuel in a failed offensive that accomplished nothing except hastening final defeat. Panzer divisions that might have defended the Rhine or delayed Soviet advances in the east were instead thrown into a doomed attack that destroyed them for negligible gains. Reinhardt's battalion participated in the offensive's opening phase, assigned to a secondary sector where they were supposed to exploit breakthrough achieved by better-equipped SS Panzer divisions. The breakthrough never came. American forces, after initial surprise, held key road junctions and prevented German armour from reaching objectives. Within days, the offensive had stalled. Within 2 weeks, it was clearly failing. By January, surviving German units were retreating back to their start lines, having lost hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and thousands of trained crew members. Reinhardt and Beck survived the Ardennes. Their Panzer IV, miraculously, was one of few battalion vehicles that reached German lines intact after the retreat order came. They had fired perhaps a dozen rounds total during the entire offensive, spending most of their time stuck in traffic jams on congested roads where Allied fighter bombers found easy targets. They had watched a Tiger battalion burn on a road north of Bastogne, destroyed not in combat but by American aircraft that caught the column stationary and massacred it systematically. The retreat destroyed whatever illusions remained about German technical superiority. Panthers and Tigers, supposedly invincible weapons that would restore Germany's fortunes, burned alongside Panzer IVs and obsolete Czech tanks. The vaunted 88mm gun that crew had whispered about in superstitious dread proved unable to save its vehicles from destruction. American tank destroyers and British Fireflies killed Tigers at ranges that were supposed to be impossible. Soviet heavy tanks that German intelligence had dismissed as propaganda proved horribly real and nearly unstoppable. By February 1945, German tank strength in the West had been effectively destroyed. Surviving units cobbled together battle groups from wreckage, mixing different tank types in ad hoc formations because standardized units no longer existed. Panzer IV commanders might find themselves leading 3 different vehicle types with incompatible ammunition and spare parts, supported by towed anti-tank guns, because self-propelled vehicles were all destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel. The Eastern Front was worse. Soviet offensives in January 1945 swept across Poland and into eastern Germany, overwhelming German defences through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. German panzer divisions that had once terrorized Soviet tank armies now fought desperate delaying actions against enemies who possessed overwhelming superiority in every category that mattered. The superstition about whispered calibers, which had started as a psychological defense mechanism, became darkly ironic. German crews stopped announcing ammunition types not because speaking calibers invited bad luck, but because there was no point. The enemy knew exactly what German tanks carried. American and Soviet intelligence had captured enough vehicles and interrogated enough prisoners that they possessed complete technical specifications for every German tank variant. They knew the capabilities and limitations of German guns better than some German crews did. More to the point, enemy tactics no longer required them to fear German firepower. American tank destroyer battalions operated with complete confidence that their 90mm guns could kill any German. Armour at combat ranges. Soviet tank armies advanced, knowing that their 34-85s and heavy IS tanks could defeat German armour through firepower and numbers. British forces with 17-pounder anti-tank guns treated German heavy tanks as dangerous but manageable threats rather than invincible superweapons. The myth of German technical superiority had collapsed so completely that even German propaganda stopped claiming it. Late-war training materials emphasized defensive tactics, ambush positions, and careful ammunition conservation rather than the aggressive combined arms maneuvers that had characterized early war doctrine. New crews received weeks of training instead of months, learning basic skills just sufficient to crew vehicles before being thrown into combat where most would die within days. Beck and Reinhardt received replacements in early March, two teenagers who looked barely 16, though their papers claimed they were 18. The boys had trained on obsolete Panzer IIIs and had never seen a Panzer IV before being assigned to the crew. Reinhardt spent an afternoon teaching them basic procedures while trying not to think about how quickly they would probably die. The new loader, a boy named Wilhelm from Bavaria, watched Beck load practice rounds and noticed immediately that the older man was whispering. "Why are you whispering?" Wilhelm asked, with the innocent curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned what questions not to ask. Beck looked at him for a long moment, then, very quietly, "Because saying the caliber aloud reminds us what we're fighting, and what we're fighting is bigger than what we have. So we whisper, and we pray, and we hope that God is listening because nobody else is." Wilhelm didn't understand. He would. Combat taught lessons that training couldn't convey. He would learn to whisper, to pray, to perform whatever rituals helped him function in a burning steel coffin, or he would die before learning. The statistics suggested the latter was more probable. Reinhardt's Panzer IV received orders on March 19th to fall back across the Rhine. The Americans had captured the Remagen Bridge intact on March 7th, establishing a bridgehead that German forces had failed to eliminate. Now Allied armies were crossing the Rhine at multiple points, and German defences were disintegrating. The orders were clear. Retreat to the east bank, destroy the vehicle if it couldn't be evacuated, and reform with whatever forces remained. They never made it. American fighter bombers caught them on a road 3 kilometers from the river. Reinhardt heard the aircraft engines, screamed for the driver to take cover, but there was nowhere to go. The P-47s came in low, rockets rippling from their wings, and Reinhardt's world became fire and noise and pain. He woke up in a field hospital, both legs burned, his left arm broken, his hearing damaged. Beck was in the next cot, alive but barely, his chest wrapped in bandages that were already soaking through with blood. Wilhelm was dead. The driver was dead. The radio operator was somewhere else, wounded or dead. Reinhardt never learned which. The war ended 6 weeks later. Reinhardt spent those weeks in various hospitals and prisoner collection points as the Allied advance rolled past him. He never crewed another tank, never fired another gun, never loaded another round of ammunition or watched another vehicle burn. For him, the war ended on that road 3 kilometers from the Rhine, when American rockets demonstrated one final time that German armor couldn't survive against enemies who controlled the skies. Beck died 3 days after the attack, his wounds too severe for the overwhelmed German medical system to treat adequately. His last words, whispered to Reinhardt when the nurses weren't watching, were, "At least I don't have to load anymore. At least I don't have to whisper." The Allied armies that occupied Germany in May 1945 discovered thousands of destroyed and abandoned German armoured vehicles. Some had been deliberately sabotaged by their crews to prevent capture. Others had simply run out of fuel and been left by roadsides. Still others had been destroyed in combat, burned out hulks testimony to the ferocity of the war's final months. American and British technical intelligence teams examined these vehicles meticulously, documenting German design philosophy and manufacturing techniques. What they found confirmed what German crews had learned through bitter experience. German tanks were, in many respects, technically superior to Allied vehicles. Their guns had better penetration, their optics were excellent, their armour layout was well designed, but they were also mechanically unreliable, difficult to maintain, and impossible to produce in quantities matching Allied output. A Tiger tank might be theoretically superior to a Sherman in one-on-one combat, but one Tiger facing 5 Shermans, which was the realistic combat ratio by late war, stood no chance, and when the Tiger inevitably broke down, there were no spare parts to repair it, while destroyed Shermans were replaced from seemingly inexhaustible reserves. The superstition about whispered calibers, documented in prisoner interrogations and captured diaries, became a footnote in intelligence reports analyzing German morale and combat effectiveness. Allied analysts noted it as evidence of declining confidence and psychological stress among German armoured forces. They were correct, though perhaps they didn't fully grasp the deeper implications. German crews had stopped announcing ammunition types, not simply because of superstition, but because the ritual of proper military procedure had become a mockery when the underlying assumptions of that procedure had collapsed. German doctrine assumed technical superiority that no longer existed. It assumed adequate supplies of ammunition and spare parts that industry couldn't provide. It assumed reinforcements and replacements that the manpower pool couldn't generate. When reality contradicts doctrine so completely, soldiers adapt by creating new informal protocols that acknowledge what official channels cannot. Whispering calibers was an adaptation, a small rebellion against the pretense that everything was normal, that German guns were still superior, that the Panzer Arm was still an elite force, rather than a collection of survivors desperately trying to postpone inevitable defeat. Post-war armour development learned lessons from German technical achievements while carefully avoiding German strategic mistakes. The United States, Soviet Union, and Britain all developed new tank designs incorporating sloped armour, powerful guns, and sophisticated fire control systems inspired partly by German innovations. But they also emphasized reliability, ease of production, and logistical sustainability, lessons learned from watching German armour choke on its own complexity. The German Bundeswehr, established in the 1950s as West Germany rearmed within NATO, built its armoured forces on principles that consciously rejected Nazi-era mistakes. The Leopard 1 tank, introduced in 1965, emphasized mobility and firepower, but also mechanical reliability and ease of maintenance. German military planners had learned that technical excellence meant nothing without industrial capacity to sustain it and logistical systems to maintain it. Nobody remembered Beck's name or recorded his whispered prayers in official histories. He was one of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who died in the war's final months, buried in temporary graves that were later consolidated into military cemeteries, where row upon row of crosses marked men whose names meant nothing to anyone except families who mourned them. The Panzer IV he crewed was scrapped for metal or left rusting in some field until local farmers hauled it away for salvage. But the psychological phenomenon he embodied, the collapse of confidence and breakdown of doctrine when reality contradicts propaganda too severely, that remained relevant. It appears whenever military forces discover that their assumed advantages don't exist, that their equipment isn't as good as they believed, that their enemies are stronger than expected, the specific details change. The underlying pattern remains constant. Soldiers whisper when they lose faith in what they're supposed to shout. They develop superstitions when doctrine fails them. They create informal adaptations when official procedures become obviously inadequate. And when enough soldiers across enough units independently develop the same adaptations, that's evidence of systemic failure that no amount of official optimism can conceal. The German Panzer Arm entered World War II, confident in its technical superiority and tactical excellence. It ended the war with surviving crews whispering ammunition types, because speaking German calibers aloud had become a reminder of industrial defeat and technological obsolescence. That transition, from confidence to whispered prayers, told the story of Germany's defeat more clearly than any battle report or casualty statistics possibly could. Reinhardt survived the war, was released from British captivity in 1946, and returned to Germany to find his hometown in ruins and his family dead. He never spoke about his time in the Panzer Arm except once, in a 1987 interview with a military historian researching German tank crew experiences. Asked about the superstition of whispered calibers, he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "We stopped saying the numbers aloud because saying them made them real. Made real that our 75mm couldn't reliably kill a Sherman frontally, Made real that the Americans had 90mm guns that could kill us at ranges we couldn't touch them. Made real that we were losing, had already lost, and were just dying slowly while pretending otherwise. So we whispered. And maybe we were fooling ourselves, but when you're sitting in a metal coffin waiting to burn, fooling yourself is sometimes the only mercy available. He died in 1992, 57 years old, but looking 80, the years of fear and trauma having taken a toll that peace could never heal. At his funeral, they found his old rosary beads in his pocket, worn smooth from decades of nervous handling, the same beads Beck had given him in the hospital, pressing them into Reinhardt's hand with his last strength and whispering, "You'll need these more than I will. Keep them. Remember." Reinhardt had kept them, had remembered, had carried the weight of memory through decades of peace that never quite erased the sound of whispering in a steel coffin, the smell of burning tanks, the faces of boys who became loaders and died before they learned to whisper properly. The calibers are printed in the history books now: 75mm, 88mm, 90mm, 122mm, just numbers on pages, clinical and precise, describing gun performance and armor penetration without capturing what those numbers meant to men who lived and died by their calculations. The books don't mention the whispers, don't explain why German crews stopped announcing ammunition types properly, don't capture the psychological weight of technical obsolescence and industrial defeat, but the whispers happened. The superstitions spread through multiple units independently. The adaptation became widespread enough that Allied interrogators noted it in reports, and that small deviation from doctrine, that quiet rebellion against procedures that had stopped making sense, told a truth that official German sources never acknowledged until after defeat made denial impossible. The Panzer Arm lost the war not because its crews lacked courage or skill. They lost because Germany couldn't match Allied industrial capacity, couldn't sustain the attrition of mechanized warfare against multiple great powers simultaneously, and couldn't bridge the growing gap between propaganda promises and battlefield reality. The technical sophistication of German armor couldn't compensate for numerical inferiority, logistical exhaustion, and strategic overextension. And in the steel coffins where German tank crews fought and died, that reality manifested as whispered numbers and silent prayers, small acknowledgements that the war was lost even as official doctrine insisted otherwise. They whispered because shouting didn't help, because nobody with authority was listening, because the calibers printed on ammunition meant less than the mathematics of industrial capacity they represented. They whispered, and they died, and the war ended, and the whispers faded into historical footnotes. But the phenomenon they represented, the psychology of soldiers losing faith in doctrine that no longer matches reality, that remains. A permanent reminder that wars are won by industry and logistics as much as courage and technology. That technical excellence without industrial capacity is a luxury that crumbles under sustained pressure. That soldiers always know when they're losing before commanders admit it. The calibers are just numbers now, but once they were whispered prayers in the darkness, small acknowledgements of truth that propaganda denied, quiet admissions that German technical superiority was a myth that had died somewhere between Normandy and the Rhine. The men who whispered those prayers are gone, but their story remains, testimony to what happens when reality shatters belief so completely that even speaking certain numbers aloud becomes a reminder of defeat too painful to acknowledge openly. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.